give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice. I'm asking the British public to take back control.
Leave suggests the EU's border-free zone helps terrorists get closer to the UK.
There's a momentum from the Leave campaign.
The losses are gigantic if the UK decides to leave.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Opinion overload, information underload, and a cartoon motherload. The coverage of the British referendum story. Buzzfeed has issues with Donald Trump that are costing the website more than $1 million.
So the Australians are saying they don't want it to happen.
And the challenges of trying to cover the dark side of Australia's refugee policy. As democratic exercises go, the upcoming referendum in Great Britain on the country's relationship with the European Union comes down to a simple question. Are you in or are you out? Then why, as the June 23rd vote approaches, is there so much confusion? And how is it that a study conducted by the London School of Economics has concluded that British voters with so many media outlets at their disposal are the worst informed people in Europe when it comes to the EU? On the print side, the British news media are notoriously, some would say gloriously partisan. Many of the politicians who want Britain to stay in are part of what their critics have come to call Project Fear, scaring voters with nightmare scenarios, particularly relating to the economy, should Britons vote to get out. That message is dutifully reflected through newspapers aligned with that side. Those advocating a Brexit from the EU are not above using fear tactics themselves. Scary headlines about uncontrolled migration, for instance. At least part of the responsibility lies with the politicians and their rhetoric. But if the news media cannot get beyond that in order to provide context and facts, all that remains are the prejudices that the media and the British people brought to this debate in the first place. Our starting point this week is London. The politicians on either side of this debate and the media outlets that stand with them have something in common with their adversaries. Both sides are using fear as a weapon, as a sales tool.
Almost as the campaign began, we were looking at the Prime Minister who was speaking on the major political television discussion programme, The Marr Show, and 5 times he talked about
a leap in the dark.
A leap into the dark.
A step into the dark.
A leap into the unknown.
I think it's uncertainty. I think it's a leap in the dark.
Project Fear was born that day.
The Daily Mail among the media has embraced this, and the red rubber stamp inevitably appears on any coverage of Remain arguments, undermining what's being put forward in those stories. But the Brexiters are using just as much of a scaremongering tactic as the Remain campaign. The immigration story seems to be their chief weapon.
The print media has started off very pro-Brexit while going in really, really hard on the immigration issue. The stories were about either immigrants or people smugglers or immigrants on benefits, and what they're left with is the kind of bare bones of their argument, which is a foreigner is going to get your job and get your house, and this is the only way to stop it.
Even the Remain camp don't have much to say that is positive about the European Union. They have lots of horrible things to say about what will happen if we leave. It's a sad fact of electoral experience around the world that fear works.
And this passport is available to 508 million people.
Fear is a really good campaigning tool, so we shouldn't be too surprised that the campaigns in this referendum are using it.
Usually, the right-wing bias of most British papers works in favour of a Conservative Prime Minister like David Cameron. But not this time, since they are to the right of Cameron on this issue. A survey by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism examined articles in 9 newspapers in the first 2 months of the campaign. It added up to 928 articles, 45% of which favored the Leave side versus 27% in favor of Remain. Media ownership and ideology have an effect on those figures. There are more conservative papers in the UK, including The Sun and The Times, both owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, plus the Daily Mail and The Telegraph, and they sell in greater numbers than liberal papers such as The Mirror and The Guardian.
Rupert Murdoch, he's got 2 major newspapers, The Sun and The Sunday Sun. He's been an avowed outer for many, many years. The Daily Mail thinks, as do I, that the European Union is too big, unaccountable, undemocratic. The Guardian, which is a small circulation newspaper these days, is in favour of Remain, so is the Daily Mirror.
There is an inbuilt right-wing bias in the UK print media, and this plays very well for the Brexit campaign. Beyond that, I suspect that there is a real instinct among journalists for the Brexit story as more exciting to them than the Remain story, which is about the status quo. Brexit is about dynamic, radical change. That's something that appeals to print journalists especially.
There's a same sort of
And the British press, the newspaper industry, can influence what is then broadcast on television and radio. There is no hard data to confirm that that has occurred during this referendum campaign. However, that agenda-setting phenomenon has been documented before, as recently as last year, during national parliamentary elections, in which Prime Minister Cameron and his Conservative Party prevailed.
On occasion, it's absolutely true that the print media can set the agenda if they break big stories. What we don't have in the UK is the situation you have in the United States, where you can surround yourself purely with your own views. Because in the US, of course, the advent of Fox means that you can watch Fox, you can listen to right-wing talk show hosts and never be exposed to other opinions. I think the fact that we still have the BBC and ITV means that most people are still having to listen to views they don't agree with.
The newspapers are still very influential. Their revenue streams are not delivering for them. Print circulation has gone through the floor, but their reach is bigger than ever. The traditional media has had its voice amplified by sites such as Facebook, for example. They might not be getting the income from that they would like, but they continue to make their voices heard.
Stories shared, voices heard. But to what effect? According to a study of EU data conducted by the London School of Economics, when European citizens were asked basic questions about the EU, no one scored lower marks than the British. Part of that is down to education, schooling, but some of the responsibility must lie with the news media. Most British news consumers just don't trust their newspapers in particular. Another EU study last year concluded that almost 3 out of 4 Britons do not tend to trust the printed press, the highest figure of all EU states by a significant margin. And there is no reason to expect that after all this referendum coverage, the dueling editorial agendas, personalities trumping policy, often served with a side order of fear, that the UK press will emerge with its reputation enhanced.
What I found uniquely depressing about the EU referendum and the UK media is that this was an opportunity for British people to make a case or to hear a case and talk about what they wanted Europe to look like and what they wanted the UK to look like. We didn't do that. And I do blame the media. We could have had a bigger conversation and we didn't.
Is that a reflection of the British media? No, it's not actually. It's exactly the point about why the Daily Mail and others think the European Union is not working. It's the task of the European Union, in my view, to make themselves relevant to our lives. It's too remote, it's too obscure, it's their fault. It's not us in the media.
But is it not the job of the journalist, when confronted by a complicated story or a complex institution such as the EU, to get past those complexities and report the story in a way audiences find relevant? That's not the institution's role, it's the news media's. And British journalists do like to call Brussels remote. It's not. It's a 2-hour train ride from London. It takes them longer to get to Manchester. They don't even need a visa to get there. At least, not yet. On the download now, our viewers on the coverage of Britain's referendum.
Personally, I'm completely avoiding all mainstream media coverage of the EU referendum. I find it all so insufferably biased and inaccurate. It's just fear-mongering and propaganda. One thing I do engage with is social media memes. At least they're entertaining.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week: the news organization behind some of the biggest financial stories of our time, including the Panama Papers, is cutting jobs because of a budget crunch. The international consortium of investigative journalists based in New York City plays a coordinating role in stories involving big data leaks. On the Panama Papers, it worked with 400 journalists in more than 70 countries. It put together similar virtual newsrooms spanning the globe with the HSBC Swiss leaks story last year and the Luxembourg leaks in 2014. The ICIJ is funded by another nonprofit, the Center for Public Integrity, which is cutting back, leading to the loss of 3 journalists at the ICIJ with more job cuts to come. The ICIJ's director, Gerard Ryle, said that he had hoped the consortium's elevated profile following the publication of the Panama Papers would help secure its future, but that the cutbacks were necessary. It's not often that privately owned news outlets turn down more than $1 million in advertising revenues. They can't afford to do that in this day and age. But that's what Buzzfeed has chosen to do because the source of those ad dollars is Donald Trump. This past week, the U.S. website announced it will not be carrying any Republican presidential ads, pulling out of a $1.3 million deal with the Republican National Committee over what it called objections to Trump's rhetoric. Buzzfeed says it will still cover his campaign, but in an email to staff, the company's CEO, Jonah Peretti, said that Donald Trump, through his proposed ban on international travel for Muslims, would make it impossible for our employees to do their jobs. We don't run cigarette ads because they are hazardous to our health, and we won't accept Trump ads for the exact same reason. Buzzfeed journalists say that they already have a contentious relationship with the Trump campaign. They are not alone in that respect, but they say that they've been denied credentials at times, denied entry to some of Trump's rallies, and directly targeted by the campaign as well as the candidate himself.
Get him out of here.
The bombing in Istanbul this past week that killed 11 people made headlines, and a few of them exposed the growing political rift between Turkey and Germany, as well as the continuing upheaval within the Turkish news media. Güneş, one of Turkey's oldest newspapers aligned with the AK Party government, ran with the headline German Job, while another publication, Yeni Söz, a conservative paper, suggested the attack was the result of collective work from the West. Turkey and Germany have been at diplomatic loggerheads ever since the German parliament voted to call the mass killings of Armenians in 1915 a genocide, a term that Turkey has long rejected. On a recent trip to Africa, President Tayyip Erdogan accused the German media of spearheading a campaign against his country. He said the stance of some sections in Germany against Turkey is unacceptable. The German media is active in this issue. We're going to take a look at the coverage of the refugee story now, not in Europe, but some 14,000 kilometers away in Australia. The Australian government has a strict policy on refugees, holding them in what it calls processing centres. They look more like prison camps for a bureaucratic waiting game that can last for years. And those camps aren't even in Australia. One is on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, the other in the Pacific island nation of Nauru. The offshore camps have been called Guantanamo Bay Down Under. The difference being they're not holding enemy combatants or prisoners of war, just refugees trying to get to Australia by boat. The government in Canberra says its detention system is designed to deter refugees who pay big money to smugglers to get them to Australia. Hundreds have already died at sea making those journeys. The camps are completely off limits to journalists, but news does trickle out. Some of the stories are chilling: torture, sexual abuse, suicides. And the penalties for the whistleblowers feeding those stories to the news media are stiff. However, journalists are still trying to tell the story, and people on the inside are still blowing the whistle. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on a news story still shrouded in secrecy in the South Pacific.
The toughest border protection measures ever.
For 4 years now, Australia has been sending a message out to the world.
If you travel by boat without a visa, you will not make Australia home.
An uncompromising message, delivered in multiple languages. The refugees who cannot be turned or towed back are taken into custody. Since the offshore camps, the so-called processing centers on the islands of Manus and Nauru opened in 2012, nearly 2,000 people have been held there, and only 60 have made it out. In those 4 years, not a single journalist has made it in.
There are extraordinary barriers to getting information out about Australia's immigration detention system. I've never been able to get to the Manus Island Detention Centre or the Nauru one, and to be honest, I probably never will. If I even set foot on Nauru, they'd probably arrest me on sight. It has essentially been a media blackout.
Unfortunately, it was not possible for me to get to either centre. It would have been fantastic to get in there to really interrogate some of the claims that are made, to work out the truth. But the reality is that nobody can get to the Nauru Centre. Indeed, these days it would be difficult even to get a visa to get to Nauru at all. In terms of Manus Island, people can get to Papua New Guinea, but the detention centre is absolutely off limits. And the few journalists who have tried to get out there before have been chased away at gunpoint, some have said.
For journalists, getting any access at all to the camps has been impossible.
This is the naval base at Manus.
In 2013, Mark Davis, a reporter for SBS TV, documented his attempts to get into the Manus Island camp.
Look, there's cops. They've seen us come up here, right?
Which turned into a blame game ping-pong match between the bureaucracies of Papua New Guinea and Australia.
I had ministers' staff directly telling me that it wasn't Australia. Australia's an open democracy. It was these troublesome countries of Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Now, I had good contacts in Papua New Guinea, and I soon established that simply was not true. I had the Prime Minister's authority to go there and his good wishes for me to get inside.
I can assure you that you are free to go to Manus anytime you want to.
Ultimately, I had the man who is the head of the processing centre, Papua New Guinea National. He finally consented to me coming into the camp, and here was the ultimate display of Australian power. The Australian guards, on orders from Australian immigration, would not open the gates.
So the Australians are saying they don't want it to happen?
Yes, that's right.
Now, there is the baldest example of who's keeping people out of those camps, and I saw it firsthand.
The guards always take them down.
The authorities may have managed to keep journalists from getting in, but they cannot prevent information from getting out. Whistleblowers have been crucial in uncovering what goes on in the offshore camps. Camp psychologists, doctors, prison guards have all spoken to reporters about the refugees, about physical abuse, lack of medical treatment, and the mental stress they suffer in the camps. In July 2013, a former security guard told SBS TV that asylum seekers were being systematically raped, with the most vulnerable being particularly preyed upon by guards.
I've never seen human beings so destitute, so helpless. The facility couldn't even serve as a dog kennel. The owners would be jailed.
And just a year ago, a welfare worker on Nauru told a parliamentary committee that security guards were paying asylum seekers for sex and then filming it. Among the Australian government's responses have been a succession of laws and measures aimed at the whistleblowers.
Well, the Australian Federal Police are used as a tool to crack down on whistleblowers by the Australian government. We know that the Australian Federal Police are prepared to use every mechanism available to them in pursuing that. As an example, we found out earlier this year that a Guardian Australia story which revealed that an Australian customs vessel had illegally entered Indonesian waters to turn back an asylum seeker boat. The journalist who wrote that story had a 200-page dossier produced on him by the Australian Federal Police.
The AFP spent hours, days, even weeks attempting to hunt down my sources. And when I requested that information under the Privacy Act, they disclosed hundreds of pages to me about their role in the investigation. What was also disclosed is that the Australian Federal Police had accessed my phone records and my email records in pursuit of my sources. And this was all done without a warrant. Now, even more recently, the government passed the Australian Border Force Act, which contains a separate offence that further criminalises information from whistleblowers and detention workers who speak out.
The Border Force Act was introduced as quite a significant restraint on people who might wish to speak out about what they know offshore. Now, it wasn't the first restraint on whistleblowers or people speaking up. From the very beginning, people working in the offshore centres have had to sign confidentiality agreements. But the Border Force Act, when it was introduced, brought in a whole new level of restraint. What it did was raise the prospect of a jail term, possibly up to 2 years, for anyone who disclosed protected information. Now, what protected information might be, the definition in the law is very broad, and the way the Act is put together, it's quite confusing and convoluted. It's difficult to work out what is and is not a crime.
We contacted the Australian Department for Immigration and Border Control with a list of questions. On why journalists are barred from the camps, they said, ask Papua New Guinea and Nauru. On why the Border Force Act of 2015 criminalizes whistleblowing, they called our question factually wrong, even though the law clearly stipulates prison time for those disclosing so-called protected information. On why the Australian Federal Police were surveilling journalists and their sources, again, they said our question was factually wrong, despite clear documented evidence of police surveillance of journalists. We ran the entire email exchange past our sources, who said our questions were factually correct and that the department's response was typical. Despite a series of disturbing stories, the offshore camps don't seem to harm the ruling Liberal Party's reputation. The Australian mainstream opposition parties, on the left and the right, also support the detention policy, and conditions in the camps don't look like they're changing anytime soon.
The national conversation around asylum seekers in Australia must seem extremely bizarre looking from a global perspective. We constantly use the word illegals. The immigration minister even said that asylum seekers and refugees were illiterate.
Well, for many people, they won't be numerate or literate in their own language, let alone English.
These are really extraordinary comments, and they do reflect some very deep-seated problems in Australia.
And there's no sense in sugarcoating that. That's the scenario.
These camps have been set up by the Australian government. They operate in the name of the Australian people, and it really is disgraceful that the government attempts to stop the Australian people from finding out what's being done in our names. The reality for these people at the moment, more than 900 people on Manus, more than 500 people on Nauru, is they're serving a life sentence.
The lack of information coming out of the offshore centres has been hugely beneficial for every government. What it does is suppress public opinion. Most people would be outraged, shocked, and definitely driven to demand a change if they were to know the reality of what's happening in these centres, because they stray so far from Australian values and also from international standards of the way humans should be treated. And I think that's the concern, as soon as people offshore become real humans with faces, with names, with stories, it's easy to identify them, we've got sympathy for them, and at that point the public demands something better of the government.
More voices on the download now on the journalistic attempts to get at the refugee story in and around Australia.
The Australian government controls the entire narrative when it comes to the offshore gulags that we use by dehumanising refugees and by using Orwellian language such that you don't even realise you're talking about people anymore. We actually threaten journalists in our country with 2-year jail terms under the Border Force Act. We bully, we use the Australian Federal Police, like we did with The Guardian, to actually investigate and to try to catch out and prosecute Australian journalists. We have created a climate of terror, intimidation, and silence.
And finally, we began this program with a look at the British news media and their tendency to skew the debate over the country's role in Europe. We'll end it with cartoonists in Europe skewering that debate. They have lots of political material to work with, and there are visual metaphors aplenty. Europe as a sinking ship, the UK doing a Monty Python-esque silly walk into the unknown, and the role that the Russian bear plays in all of this. This collection of cartoons also reveals how some Europeans see Great Britain. A country at sea, an island nation on the edge of a continent, but not quite on it, which summarizes what this debate is all about. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.